Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our live stream Medical Mysteries and Personal Crises. My name is Ashley. I am the marketing assistant here at Signature Editions, and I just wanted to welcome you all here. Just a few things to get started before I introduce everyone. So if you are experiencing any technical difficulties throughout the stream, first try refreshing your page. Sometimes Facebook will sometimes glitch. You can have some issues with that. So try refreshing your page. That sometimes helps. If that doesn't work, you can try closing the window and then coming back in. We also may experience some technical difficulties on our end. There's potentially some weather-related issues where we may lose power or something like that. So if that occurs, we're going to try our best to go ahead and get everything back and running again. We'll still be on this link. Just be warned of that. We also have a coupon code, again, for this live stream. So if you want to get 20% off of any of the books that we're talking about this evening, you can use the coupon code HEALTH20. And there are links to all of the books, both in the description for the live stream, as well as in the pinned comments. Use that discount code to get that 20% off. And at the very end of our live stream, we will be taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions that you would like to have answered by one of our authors, just put them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end. So without further ado, let's start introducing our authors. So we're going to first introduce Amy. Let's bring Amy onto the screen here. There's Amy. So Amy is a music teacher that lives in Ottawa with deep roots in the prairies, having grown up in rural Manitoba. Amy maintains a busy studio teaching piano and music theory to students of all ages. She enjoys connecting with young musicians across the country as a music festival adjudicator and examiner for the Royal Conservatory of Music. Amy also tries to carve out a few minutes every day for writing. Amy's first book, Micro Miracle, is the moving account of her experiences as a first-time mother and how her expectations of childbirth and parenting were dramatically altered when she gave birth to her daughter, Madeline, 16 weeks premature. Now a healthy 7-year-old, Madeline is eagerly awaiting the birth of her baby brother in August.
She's very eager.
So welcome, Amy. So next we're going to introduce Marion. So let's bring Marion on screen. Hi, Marion.
Hi.
So, Marion was born in Oklahoma, but spent her childhood summers in the Canadian Shield at a rustic camp that her grandfather built. She was working as a technical writer and editor in the US when her mother developed dementia. There are actually over 500,000 Canadians currently living with dementia, and as the baby boomer population ages, that number is expected to grow to nearly 1 million people in the next 15 years. Marion's book Reverberations, which was recently shortlisted for the Louis de Creline Lawrence Award for Nonfiction, seeks to open a space where people living with dementia and their care partners can talk about the disease without stigma. Marion now lives with her husband in a house next door to the old family property, and she enjoys posting pictures of the beautiful lake on her Instagram. So welcome, Marion.
Thanks, Ashley. Hey, Amy.
And last but certainly not least, we have Vanessa.
Hi.
So Vanessa Farnsworth is a writer and science journalist living in the interior of British Columbia. She has published more than 100 columns and articles in national and regional publications, runs and operates the Lyme Disease in Canada website, and publishes a bi-monthly email newsletter called The Lyme Report, which is dedicated to tick and tick-borne illness research in Canada. Vanessa has spoken to literally hundreds of Lyme patients from across the country about their experiences with tick-borne illnesses and their experiences with the healthcare system. Vanessa is also a fiction writer, and her short stories can be found in a variety of literary journals and her short story collection, The Things She'll Be Leaving Behind. Vanessa also has a historical novel entitled The Haw Eaters, published by Signature Editions, that will be coming out this August. So welcome, everyone. So do we want to start right into the questions then?
Sure.
Okay. So our first question is, why did you want to publish a work so personal and intimate about a life event that was so difficult for you? So Vanessa, do you want to answer this one first, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it wasn't so much for me wanting to tell my personal story. What I wanted to tell was the truth about Lyme disease in Canada, because I felt that we were only getting part of the picture of what Lyme disease was. So I found when I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and this was back in 2007, and at that time Lyme disease wasn't as well known as it is now. So I think there were between 50 and 60 cases in all of Canada at that point, and I had the misfortune of being one of them. And I found that when I was searching for information about Lyme disease, if I went up on a public health website, for instance, I would find that the disease that they were describing did not seem to have very much relationship to the disease that I was actually suffering from. And I began to wonder, well, why is that? And the search for the answer, why is that, really led me to decide that, we have a story to tell in this country about what Lyme disease really is, as opposed to maybe the way it tends to be presented by public health, which tends to focus in on those early symptoms and not what happens when it goes untreated for many months or many years. So I decided we need to talk a lot about that. I decided we need to talk about the challenges that the healthcare system has in dealing with tick-borne illnesses specifically, but climate-driven diseases in general, which is something that's very new to our healthcare systems and something that our healthcare systems do a very poor job in dealing with. And so I decided that I would go the personal route in telling the story, because I really wanted to tell what it was like to live with Lyme disease and drop the reader right down into that. And as a journalist, normally what I would do is do all the research and then go out and find somebody to interview. But I felt that if I did that, people tend to like to present the best versions of themselves publicly, and they tend to edit themselves and leave out all the ugly bits. And I decided I wanted to tell the story with all the ugly, horrible things in it, including the fear and the anger and my bad behavior, as well as the bad behavior of others. So I decided that I would tell my story because I could invade my privacy all that I wanted. I wasn't comfortable invading other people's privacy, but I could invade my own privacy as much as I actually wanted. And in doing so, I could tell what it's really like to live with the disease and just give that unvarnished truth. So that's really how I came to the decision to tell the personal story. It's one thing we do very well as writers is we bleed in public in a way that the average person sort of doesn't want to do that. We go, well, you know what, if you want to tell the truth of it, and I think that's where people really get into stories, is when you tell the unvarnished truth, just the raw emotion of a story. That is where we tend to connect. And so I think that's something that as writers we do very well, is we just strip it bare and say, this is what it's like to live with, in my case, Lyme disease. And this is the reality of what the disease is. So for those of you who only know Lyme disease in terms of what you see on public health sites or on the media, you get this very superficial view that makes it seem as though Lyme disease isn't much worse than the flu. Well, for some people, it is catastrophic. And so that was really my goal here, was just let's tell what Lyme disease really is.
Mm-hmm. Marion, what about you? Was it also a similar desire of kind of bringing awareness to Alzheimer's, or?
Well, that was why I eventually kept working on my essays and eventually wanted to publish them. But I kind of separated the writing of it from the publishing part, because for writing, I was in the middle of it, going through, watching my mother kind of change in front of my eyes, watching my father be angry, as Vanessa was saying, the ugly parts of it too. And I wanted to remember all that, because it would have been really easy for me to just visit them for a weekend and then go home and pretend it wasn't happening. And I didn't want to do that. And so that's why I originally did the writing of it. When it came time to publishing, I wanted to publish for a couple of reasons, because there's a lot of stigma still around dementia and Alzheimer's. And I just wanted a way for people to have the opportunity to talk about it. As baby boomers, my mom died 20 years ago, so this is not exactly news. For me, it's not something I'm in the throes of right now. And sadly, not very much has changed in the past 20 years. I say somewhere in one of my essays that we know a whole lot more about what Alzheimer's isn't, but not a whole lot more about what it is. And so just finding a way to keep the conversation going as the baby boomers age. There's going to be more and more people who either have the disease or have a loved one with the disease or know someone, and we need to talk about it. So that was to write, I'm a writer, so that's why I wrote about it at the time. It helped me track what was happening. I have siblings, I have 3 brothers and a sister, and they would want to know what was happening. And so that was why I wrote it at the time. And then when it came time to publish, it was because I had the sense that there are people who need a way to talk about this. And I know that someone has given this book as a gift, and that opened a conversation where they could start talking about one of his loved ones' dementia for the first time. And that's the kind of story that I wanted to hear.
Mm. Amy, what about you? Why did you want to publish a work that was so personal?
I started writing the story just so that Madeline would have a record of really the miraculous things that happened around her birth, because I knew I would forget. It's true. Everything turns into a blur after you have a child. So for the first year after she was born, we kept her at home. Her immunity was very, very low. And she would take these huge 3-hour naps. And I found myself with time to actually sit and write. And I started journaling through the story. And after I got a certain distance in, I realized this would make a good story in a universal sense for others, not just Madeline. And we were just chatting off camera before this began about what we do well in Canada as a healthcare system and what we don't do well. And Vanessa and Marion are both describing stories where we've not made a great deal of progress on either treating a condition or finding a cure for it. But here's something we actually do extraordinarily well. And there are other books on the market that describe similar stories to mine, but there was very little from the Canadian perspective. Instead, we had Americans who, in the past, certainly were worried, would my insurance cover my baby's hospitalization? Can we even do a resuscitation? Can we afford this? And for us as Canadians, that was never a conversation. We could discuss all of the treatment from the perspective of what is best for this child versus what can we afford. And that's a really beautiful thing in Canada, that when we do something well in the healthcare system, it really was done well for Madeline. So it was a story that I thought should be shared with Canadians and outside of our own country.
Thank you. So our next question is, at a time when you were going through this critical change, did you keep notes, a journal, photos, records of mail or email correspondence? Like, how did you keep a record of what you were trying to deal with through this situation? Did that help with your writing process? Marion, do you want to comment on that one first, please?
Sure. I think I mentioned I wrote things because I was sort of the designated person at that time to be with our parents, and then would let my brothers and my sister know what had happened that weekend, or if I had gone to look at a special residence in the region or something like that. So there, I had some of that, but I would also I have notes that were written on church bulletins that, we'd gone to church that morning, and Mom said something on the way home, and I wrote it on the bulletin surreptitiously. And then when I went home back to my own house, my own home in Colorado at the time, I would write it up into scenes and try to make a narrative of it, or try to just keep it as fresh as I could while remembering what she said, because words are such a large part of the dementia process. And then afterwards, I also had her medical records, and there were other papers like that that I kept and have looked at over the years. And then my father passed away in 2007. And when we were going through his house, my parents' house, not one single piece of paper had left in the entire 40 years that they lived in that house. So we would get to pages that were about Mom or Dad or Canada, the lake, And my siblings would say, here, this is for Marion. We'll put this in her box. So I had the opportunity to go through a lot of those photos and papers too, and found some interesting things, like my grandmother's diary from when my mom was at Queens. So, I mean, it had benefits to it as well. But there was a time when I was sort of felt like I was drowning in papers. And I wasn't even trying to document my own illness. I can't imagine how Vanessa did this.
Do you want me to take over?
Yeah, sure.
So how did I do it? I had virtually no functional memory for an extended period of time, better part of a year. And so for me, documenting the illness, I wasn't thinking it in terms of being a writer and something I was going to publish at a later date. I had to write everything down because I had virtually no memory that I could access for an extended period of time. So if I went to a doctor's office, I couldn't say to them, well, on Monday I had this horrible thing happen to me, because there was no Monday for me. There was no hour ago. There wasn't even 5 minutes ago. My memory was extraordinarily affected due to all the information in my central nervous system, and specifically in the brain. And so without a functional memory, I had no choice but to write it all down. And so it became really weird because it was a very disorganized way in which I was functioning. I wouldn't write it in journals necessarily. I would write it down on whatever piece of paper I had, and it would be symptoms some days I was writing down, or what I was eating, or what terrible thing was happening, but just so I could get through the day. And those notes were very interesting because I would come across them and I would have no memory of having written the notes. I would have no memory of what I was writing about. And so it's a bit like being haunted by your own ghost. You know, you see these time travel movies, right, where people go back in time and they write the message to help you so that you can get out of whatever problem you're in. And it was like that. It was like I was being visited by my own ghost who was coming back and giving me all these little pieces of information. And then, of course, when I was doing the research, because I had no choice but to do research into Lyme disease. Because at that period of time, when I was the first person in my community ever to have a confirmed case of Lyme disease, I was one of, I think, 2 or 3 people in the Kootenays ever to have a confirmed case of Lyme disease. So there was nothing like medical knowledge or medical expertise on the illness. And I found that doctors were giving me very conflicting advice on what to do and ideas about treatment. And I found that the public health agencies were not much help. So I found that I had to do research, and research got very interesting because of that memory problem. So if I got to page 2 of a report, I couldn't remember what was on page 1. And sometimes I could not remember when I was in paragraph 2 of a report what was on paragraph 1. So I got into the habit of just simply writing down every time I read a report and I saw something in it that applied, I would just write it down. And so you get through this process, and there comes a point where you've got a ton of paper on just the experiential side of it, and you've got a ton of paper on the research side of it, and then you decide, well, actually, I had a conversation with my psychologist, because at that time I was coming through the worst of Lyme disease, and this was maybe 3 years after, maybe 4 years after, and she suggested that, you know, and I was there because I had suffered significant trauma as a result of just the horrific things I went through from the disease, trauma of having to fight with the healthcare system at a time in my life when I was least capable of having that fight. And so the end result of that was trauma. And her suggestion was, well, you know, you're a writer. And of course, I had to have a psychologist tell me this. You're a writer. Why don't you write about it? It could be cathartic. And so that was when I just took all these pieces of paper and started fitting them together, almost like puzzle pieces, into this story of Lyme disease. So the answer is yes, I did write about it at the time, but only because I didn't have a memory to speak of. And that was my memory, was this piece of paper, these pieces of paper that were floating around. And yeah, and there was really no, it's sort of one sort of bled into the other. So there was no me standing back and looking at Lyme disease from a distance. It was me just sort of bringing it all together. And then I think I ended up with a 1,000-page book. And then I cut it down to about 200 pages and just took out all of the stuff that was duplicates or boring or whatever. People didn't really need to see that I need to do laundry today, or this is what I'm going to pick up at the grocery store. Got all the stuff that people don't care about, take that out and just put the stuff in that's relevant.
you were talking earlier, Vanessa, about how people tend to show their best versions of themselves. And I found that when I went back and looked at emails that I was writing through sort of the worst crisis time, and we were so afraid of being dramatic that we didn't want to overstate what was happening. So when I read the emails, I'm like, that's actually not very representative. That is a watered down version of how ill Madeline was. When I compared it on the same date against the medical records, I saw that even email correspondence, right? Everything you have to try and look at through the lens of, well, what is actually the fact and what got reinterpreted along the way.
Yeah, I did a lot of hide how sick I was. Now, when you've got a severe neurological infection, that is pretty hard to do. I thought I was doing an excellent job of hiding it and just sort of, giving this best version of myself. I heard afterwards from neighbors and from friends that yes, they would pretend with me at the time, and then the minute I left the room, they would all talk about, oh, she looks so awful. But I think that is the very human part of us, is that we don't want to show that weakness in ourselves, and we don't want to show just how bad things are, and we often don't want to admit how bad things are, because when you admit the full breadth of it, like with Madeline, you don't want to admit just how bad that is. You want to look at that bright place where somehow, some way, she's going to get better. And with me, it was the same thing. Somehow, some way, I'm going to get better. So because that's the truth, whether it is or not, because I have to believe that's the truth, I'm going to pretend that I'm not as sick as I really am and give this false sense. But, the book went and corrected that.
Amy, did you have trouble? Do you mind, Ashley?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Amy, did you have trouble? People wanted to be nice, like they wanted to be concerned, and you'd be like, don't be nice to me because it's going to make me cry. I mean, was there some of that with why you were sort of watering down, if you will, your experience?
I think it was mostly people who were far away and weren't, all my relatives are not in Ontario. They're all across Canada. And I thought, well, what's the point in worrying them more than we need to? Mm-hmm. And I mean, my mother knew the truth. There's a few people you never hide things from. I think I also tried to avoid personal contact with as many people in my own area as possible. And I think that was it's a survival mechanism, because it takes too much work and energy to explain exactly what's happening. And you have to preserve that energy for the fights you have to fight. My job is a music teacher, and I went back to work 2 weeks after Madeline was born, self-employed. And and you're dealing with a 9-year-old, you're dealing with kids. And I remember so many times in lessons, so zoned out, worrying and being concerned about what was happening in the hospital. But a 9-year-old, even the most heartfelt 9-year-old, they're not here to take that burden on. You are the adult in the room. They are paying you for a service, and you have to provide it. And I think in some ways that helps you get through, or else I think you would just sit at home and cry the entire time. Mm-hmm. And you have to pull yourself together, and now it's time to teach. Move on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of related to our next question, which is how long does it kind of take to process the life-changing experience? So after kind of you've finished going through the middle of it, how long did it take for you to be able to really start writing about it? So Marion, I know that there was a considerable amount of time between your mother's experience and before Reverberations came out as the final book that it was. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. I was writing, of course, at the time. And because I was also a professional writer, I was like, well, whatever I write is going to be wonderful and publishable, and without really thinking about what I wanted to say or what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. And I eventually gave that up because I wanted to tell, as Vanessa has been talking about, I wanted to tell the ugly parts. I wanted to tell about all the rage and all the disappointment and all that stuff. And people were really, really wanting an uplifting story, movie of the week kind of a thing. And that was just not what I was ready to give. And then, my life continued to change. And in 2005, I became a permanent resident here in Canada, and I moved here. And again, after that point, there came a point where I was like, I have all this. these stories, and I have all this writing, and that was a formative experience for me. I was in my late 30s, and it was kind of when I became an adult for the first time. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to do something with it, or I wanted to have the freedom and knowledge that I had done what I wanted to with it and put it away and move on. And so I started looking again at it in shorter forms, as personal essays instead of as a narrative arc. And that seemed to work better with the way my mind works, or with my writing chops at the time for creative nonfiction. And so people responded to that. Literary journals liked those essays. And so I kept plugging along. And finally, at one point, it really became sort of, okay, really, I need to either get serious about this or not. And I kept writing. I've been writing about something other than my mother. I started saying that I would really like to write about something other than my mother, probably 10 years ago. And I'd bring something to a writing group and they'd say, this is about your mom. And I was like, no, it is not, but it was. And so I had a lot of stuff to work through, and I can't even guarantee now that I'm done. If you're ever done writing about your mother, I can't guarantee that I'm done with that. But I have this material that I was working with from the past that I feel fairly confident that I have done justice to. I mean, I hate to think of it as material. It was a life experience for, my mom and my dad and me and my whole family. But I feel like I've done justice to it. And so I can set that aside a little bit and start to move forward even more now. But 20 years, yeah, it's a long time.
Vanessa, what about you? So how long was it in between like all of the notes and before it started to actually turn into more of a full narrative? Okay. It looks like Vanessa is experiencing some technical difficulties. So Amy, how about you answer this question? Hopefully Vanessa will be with us in a moment.
I'm sure once the passing thundercloud has left Vanessa, she'll be back to us. Yeah. I started writing right away. Certainly at the beginning, it's more emotional than towards the end. I wrote a lot of drafts, and I think that there's somewhat of just the whole revision process that does also divorce you from it emotionally a little bit. As you're trying to clean up the text and really think about your words, certainly one becomes less emotional about it. I was just thinking, Marion, as you were talking about your mom, that you were right. Oh, good, Vanessa's back. That you were writing about your mom after she had already left, and that you're trying to honor her and respect her memory, still while revealing the extent of her illness. My mother is one of the major characters in Micro Miracle because she was there. And I wanted to do my mother justice as well, but my mother is very much alive and very cognizant. And one of the sort of most scariest bits of the revision process was giving my mom the manuscript and being like, okay, have at it. Tell me what you think. And she's always been excellent about it. And she'll probably say, I don't love everything you wrote, but she's supportive regardless. Sort of two different experiences.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Vanessa, what about you?
So there wasn't really that much space between the time that I was suffering the illness and the time that I was writing about it, because it is an illness that stretched on for many years. So I think I was through the worst of it, but I had no way of knowing that. I think I was really careful when I was doing the rewrites and the editing on it. I think the thing, usually you want to stand back and have some distance so you can be objective about it. But I found one of the things that I wanted to do was not introduce knowledge that I gained later into the story that I was telling. Mm-hmm. And for those people who have read the book, it's broken into 3 parts based on Dante's Divine Comedy. So the central part, Purgatorio, during that time, a lot of what I'm describing in that book is the result of seizures, temporal lobe seizures. I didn't know that at the time I was writing it. I had no way to know that that's what was happening. So when we're talking about the deja vu and the visual hallucinations and the strange phantom smells and the out-of-body experiences, all of those things were the result of seizures that were happening in a certain part of the brain that sort of roots you in reality. And it occurred to me while I was doing the rewrites and the editing of it that I didn't want to introduce into the book knowledge that I did not have at that time, because at the time it was incredibly terrifying what was happening. It was very confusing what was happening. And if I were to explain what was happening so that other people could understand it, it sort of gave the idea that I understood what was happening. And when you understand what's happening, I mean, seizures are scary things to live through. And I was having dozens of them a day at one point. But I didn't know what they were, which made them even more scary, because you know that there's something fundamentally going wrong with your brain. Mm-hmm. You're suddenly standing in a room that you were not standing in 5 minutes ago, and you have no idea how you got there. Time collapses on you. Memory collapses on you. And so I think that was the biggest thing for me, was to balance that, be true to what it was when you were writing about it. Don't correct the errors, because there are mistakes in the book, but they were mistakes that were genuine, because they were mistakes that I was making at that time through a misunderstanding. In the hair. So I was seeking health care from.
It seems like Vanessa's having some.
Anybody who.
So it seems like Vanessa's having some technical difficulties right now. Frozen again. So how about we move on to our next question? What was it like turning it over to an editor who will obviously see the story through different eyes? So, Amy, you'd mentioned turning it over to your mother and how that was kind of difficult. But what was it like turning it over to your editor?
I was excited. I was very excited to get a new perspective. I was getting tired of it. I think I was on about my 13th draft or something ridiculous. And Karen, the editor at Signature, she's so phenomenal. And she would make suggestions that were never, never you have to do it this way, but have you considered it? And it was a great experience.
Wonderful. Vanessa, what about you? What was it like turning your book over to an editor?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm the one who's having the weather-related issues, so I may just keep popping in and out as the lightning keeps striking. What was it like? I've been doing this for so long. Like, I started professionally writing in 1992, and I really hate to say that because it makes me feel old. But I have a lot of experience turning things over to editors. So for me, that wasn't a big deal. I sort of have the ability to look at things from the outside as I go through the personal editing process. So I think there weren't significant changes made to the manuscript. Karen, who is the owner of Signature Edition, she's the one who did the editing on it. She did not make significant changes. Mostly what she did was move things around. So the first chapter that I turned in for the book, I think actually ends up somewhere like 2/3 of the way through the book. And so the second chapter became the first chapter. There was very little that we cut out that I can remember. It was just really reorganizing the book so that somebody who wasn't me could actually understand. Because if you read the book, it goes back and forth between personal experience and research, and back and forth and back and forth. So we had to figure out some way to just make that flow a little bit better. I was happy with it not flowing because I was having a very disjointed experience of life at that point. So I thought you should all have a disjointed experience of my experience. So that worked for me. But Karen thought, yeah, let's smooth this out a little bit. So that was really the experience for me. So I have a lot of experience with editors, so it wasn't really a big deal for me to turn it over at all.
Okay. Marion, what about you?
Well, like Amy, I welcomed the other perspective, and so it was really nice to have someone else's eyes on it after a while. And I mean, I've also been edited by other people, but this is different because it was so personal. Even short stories I've had published, or in a writing group I've had suggestions. It's a little bit different. Sometimes I forget that, oh yeah, this is all made up. These people don't have to actually even exist. But in creative nonfiction, or this particular story, things actually happened, and so I was very determined to keep all the parts there that had been perhaps less palatable, or that were difficult to read about, because you know that there's not really a happy ending. Like with Amy's story, Madeline got to come home. And I know that Vanessa survived her experience because here she is writing about it. But, people, if you're writing about an aging parent, chances are pretty good that you know what's going to happen to that parent at some point. So I didn't have anything. I had to walk a lot of those lines, and I really was interested in having fresh eyes on it. I had felt fairly strongly, since I had figured out that personal essays work fairly well for how my mind works and how I wanted to package the experience. There was some disjointedness in my manuscript as well, and some repetition because they'd been published individually. And so every essay I had to explain, who is my mother? Why was she important? Why was this sad for me? I lived in Canada, we lived in the States, that whole thing. I had to explain a lot of that in every single essay. And Karen was instrumental in figuring out where do I explain it once, the most important time, where it needs to be, so that someone who is reading through the book understands it. But I didn't want to rewrite it as a memoir with a narrative arc, because I felt that the distance had given me the perspective. And so writing it as, where mom basically would have died in the middle somewhere, and then here I am just living here, that wouldn't have been as an effective a manuscript or a description of what it's like to have parents who continue to come back around in my life the way that mine do. And I'm guessing that that's true for a lot of people. You never know when you're going to think about your mom and dad. It surprises you sometimes. So, and so having an editor was just really great to walk through that and say, yeah, you need to say this over here, and not wait for the reader and hope that they get to that point to get it explained to them.
Thank you. I think we'll have time for another couple of questions before we start taking questions from the audience. Just a reminder to the people in the audience to be leaving those questions in the comments. Our next question is, did you ever worry about retaliation from the people in the healthcare system, or from potentially offending any of your family members? So Vanessa, do you want to maybe comment on this one first?
Yeah, is my microphone on? I'm getting a muted microphone message.
Your microphone's on.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot because my book is very critical of the healthcare system, and how it failed me and how it fails other people suffering from tick-borne illnesses, particularly Lyme disease. Did I fear that doctors were going to retaliate against me, or some invisible public health official was going to move against me? And the answer was no, not really. I think at the time I was writing it, I was really outside the healthcare system at that point. It turned out to be impossible to get healthcare, so I actually had to leave the healthcare system to get treatment. And so really, what were they going to do? Double down? I mean, once you're not getting treatment, you're not getting treatment. And I find a lot of people with Lyme disease are very worried about talking publicly because they think their doctors would ditch them, or that in some way they will be retaliated against. And, that hasn't happened. The fact that I left names out of the book, so no doctor is actually named, was very helpful, I'm sure. But it wasn't really a concern of mine, largely because it was more important to me to talk about the failures. There's no way to fix the failures unless we talk about them. So we need to talk about what went wrong for me and what's going wrong with people for Lyme disease, because if we don't talk about it, we cannot possibly hope to fix it. And so I didn't worry too much about retaliation, and I'll tell you, I didn't get any retaliation back in the early days. when I would go doing public speaking engagements, I can tell you there were a few incidents where doctors actually boycotted and made it very clear to organizers that they didn't want me speaking about Lyme disease. I believe one of them even actually said a patient does not have the right to talk about their illness publicly, which I thought was an extraordinary statement. And I just can't imagine they would say that to somebody who had cancer or a heart disease, but they felt free saying that about somebody with Lyme disease. And the unfortunate part of them doing that protest at that point, there were 2 doctors that actually protested that one event. I was actually talking at that event about Lyme disease in nature, not in human beings. I was talking about Lyme disease in mouse and in mice and in deer and what's happening in nature that is causing this proliferation of tick-borne illnesses. So it was crazy to me that they would do that. But that didn't directly impact me. It really made the organizers feel really badly. And there was a point there that I thought they were going to cancel it. But I actually invited those doctors to come to the event, and I assured them I'm not going to be attacking doctors. And one of them, that did, to their credit, one of those doctors who protested did actually show up. And I'm not a scary human being, and I wasn't saying scary things. But yeah, retaliation is something that people worry about, I think, a little bit too much. I think when you've been publishing for almost 20 years, you realize that, you are allowed to state your opinion in this country. Usually people aren't so petty that they're going to retaliate. Doctors have
unless they send thunderstorms and cut you right off so that you can't say anything.
Supernatural powers they have.
Yeah.
So, Amy, maybe do you want to answer the question? We'll see if Vanessa can finish.
Yeah, rejoin us at some point. I think it's interesting, maybe more the concept of, okay, can you tell the truth about your personal life without offending family members? Because a lot of our life stories do revolve around family and their reactions. And I think I read something one place where the author was arguing that at the end of the day, your family is still more important than the story. But I think that's a personal decision, deciding how much you're willing to risk, to be honest, as an author versus offending a family member. And really, I think it comes down to everyone's personal comfort and to what end, right? If I wrote this in this way, would it really serve the story, or would it just upset people? Probably, Marion, you had a few of those moments too. You talked a lot about family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's a lot easier to publish with both of my parents gone, but I was also careful, or I tried to be careful to not paint myself as the hero that, every time my dad was mad, I would get mad. I was mad. I mean, I had my own faults that I tried to include as much as possible. And I think that helped. And in terms of my siblings, I thought about them. My sister, who I see is watching, appears in a couple of the essays, and I appreciated her support so much during that time. But my feeling is also that I tried to write about what I saw and what I experienced. And my siblings are all intelligent and creative and good writers, and they can write their own experiences if they would like to. But this was what I was going through, and that's all I can claim. I wasn't saying this is how the Agnew family handled dementia. It wasn't that at all. It was just my stumbling way through it. So, I mean, it's something to think about for sure. And I think it helps if you're as honest about your own shortcomings as a human being as if you're, instead of just pointing the finger at someone else. Which I have to say, a couple of my drafts about things about my dad were pretty much like, he's doing it wrong. And even I got tired of reading it.
It was interesting, Marion, when I was reading through your work about how essentially you have the parent who is very cognizant and then the parent who is suffering from dementia. And somehow the parent who is supposed to be the one who knows what's going on, how they had a hard time accepting the deterioration of the patient with dementia. And I mean, these are things that you see in other families, right? With dementia, this is not just to you; it's universal. And then you sort of start to wonder, well, how cognizant is that other person? Like, do you not understand this woman has dementia or this man has dementia? And so I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for you to write in a way that was not judging your father, but yet saying, I don't understand his reactions right now.
It was, and that's part of what I think the time that elapsed did for me, was help give me the experience of knowing that he was there with her and he had to cope. Like, there's a way that of people who are living with dementia themselves and people who are their care partners, both, they look for ways to get through the day. They look for things that they can do that feel good together. For calm times, are we getting, they have standards. Can we get some meals today? That if that's what they can get through, that's what they get through. But yeah, it was difficult. And my father was really private. They had been so sufficient to the two of them. And he really was reluctant to invite other people into their situation. They did have people through the church who came to spend time with Mom, but she was already a little bit too wary of new people for that to work very well. But Daddy made some male friends during that time that did help him for the next 10 years. But yeah, it was hard to know. And I couldn't like grab him by his shoulders and say, what is wrong with you? Because I didn't know, he needed some form of denial, I think, to continue.
And maybe at the early stages of dementia, you can talk someone back. If it's just a little bit of confusion, you can kind of bring them back. And then that behavior perhaps continues, even when it's not possible to bring this person back to reality.
Well, and that's like when I was saying, I really, really, really just wanted to go back to my home and pretend that everything was fine and I had been making it up. I'm sure that there was a lot of that on my father's part too, because there is in some situation, there is no benefit to be gained from a diagnosis or from naming it. There are certainly a whole lot more opportunities now for people who have a diagnosis, to receive care or to be referred to appropriate agencies who can provide some support for both the person with it and the care partner. So it makes a difference now. But at the time, it was sort of like, why acknowledge it? Because there was nothing to be gained by it.
Vanessa, did you want to add anything? You'd gotten cut off a little bit towards the end of your answer.
No, I have no idea what went out and what didn't. The lightning just keeps striking. So, whatever I said, I go with it.
Okay.
I think the last thing I said was, unless we talk about what the problems are, we can't fix the problems. So people just really shouldn't be overly concerned that criticizing the healthcare system is going to bring retaliation. It doesn't. Typically it doesn't, and it can be helpful.
So this is a question specifically for Amy that's kind of related to the last one, but what is it like writing about someone who will one day read this book? So again, kind of getting back to what are the worries of the reaction of the family members?
What would Madeline think? Well, first of all, Madeline thinks it's completely normal to have a story written about you. In the eyes of a 7-year-old princess, why wouldn't everyone have a story written about them? So that's going to be a coming back down to earth moment at some point. I think that Madeline as a premature infant versus Madeline as a baby or even a small child, they're just such two different creatures. When I see her now, I don't see the baby. And I think that's how it's going to feel for her too. She doesn't remember it. She doesn't know what happened. So it's going to feel like two different people.
Makes sense. So do you guys have any advice that you would like to give to any aspiring writers, people that are thinking about wanting to write about life-changing events or anything like that? What did you learn from your experience? So Marion, do you want to maybe give some of your words of wisdom first?
Sure. I don't know how wise they are, but it really did work for me to, when I'm going through something, to write about it at the time and separate thoughts of publishing from that time of capturing the experience. And it's not that, I mean, if I were to write something more like Vanessa's inquiry into Lyme disease, if I were to take that on and do something like that about dementia, it might be different, but I wouldn't have been able to do that at the time. If you're going through a difficult personal thing, write down the things that you want to write down and allow the revision and worrying about publishing it to come at a different day. I think the more important thing is that it be meaningful to you, that the experience can be a really meaningful experience, whether you decide to publish at all.
Amy, what about you? What advice do you have?
I think that it can be very cathartic, and we've all said that writing helps you process things. I also think it's important, like Marion says, to maybe not be looking for, the narrative arc or the moral to the story or the point of this thing, because truth and real gripping writing comes from the emotion and the details of the moment, and everything else can be pieced together later. But live that moment and as many details as you can remember. Smells, colors, textures, like the things that you tend to forget. For me, it was lying in a hospital bed and there being this water-stained panel above my head and being so angry that the panel was water-stained. Like, what does that have to do with anything? But it shows the emotional, the way I was feeling in that moment. So those tiny details, get them written down if you possibly can, and you can draw on them later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you said about write it down. You think you'll remember, it'll just be fused with your brain. You won't. You'll forget most of the details, or you'll misremember, and that's always nasty. So write it down, and don't worry about putting it into a story yet. It's just research. Just write it down, throw it into a shoebox, and just move on with your life. I will warn people who want to write about their illness or a trauma that's happened in their life is that you end up having to live it 3 times. So you live it the first time as you go through it, you live it the second time as you write about it, and you live the third time as you go out and talk to the world about it. And so depending on the level of trauma you've been through, that can be incredibly a challenging thing to do. And the other caution I would say is that when it comes to the publishing side of things, it can be a little bit challenging to publish memoirs of illness. You'll find that a lot of publishers just will state right on their website, we are not interested in any memoirs about illness. Agents will often say the same thing. So if you have this really great story about this trauma that's happened to you, you really do need to get some sort of a publishing background first, even if it's just articles in a magazine or snippets in literary journals. You need to get something behind you to prove to the publisher or the agent that you are worth paying attention to. Otherwise, your manuscript may not ever actually get out of the slush pile. It may actually end up getting rejected from somebody who just got out of university and their entire job is going through slush piles. It's like, oh, another one about illness, and chuck it off to the side. So you really want to give them a reason to pay attention to you. And other than that, you write it all down. Honestly, you will not remember. Even if you have a better memory than I had at the time, you would be surprised how easy it is to think that somebody was wearing a red shirt when they were really wearing a blue shirt, to think that something happened on a certain day on a Sunday, but it actually happened on, it's so easy to make those mistakes. And you don't need to have to worry about narrative, just write down the details and then you just thread it together at a date. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not seeing any questions per se in the comment section. We still have couple more minutes. If anyone wants to quickly type in some questions, please do so now. I'm just going to reiterate again that you can find links to buy all of the books. So Micro Miracle, Reverberations, and Rain on a Distant Roof. You can find links to those in the pinned comments. Remember to use the the coupon code HEALTH20 to get that 20% off. That discount is going to be valid for the next 24 hours. So do be sure to use that. Still not seeing any questions.
We've been so comprehensive in our discussion, Ashley. There's nothing more to say.
Maybe, okay, here's a question. Sue wants to know, what is next for you? What are you currently working on? So Amy, what about you? What's next for you? We know one big exciting thing that's next.
Right. Yes, the baby in August. I'm always working on, as a music teacher, I do a lot of writing for music periodicals. So I had a couple that were to be published this spring, and COVID-19 changed the scope of those magazines' publications. So they've been put on the back burner. But I'm doing some guest writing for a blog, music related. And my big epic project, which I've been working on for the last year and a half, is a family related piece. So as we're talking about family, I delved into the life of a great grandmother who her life was always a bit of a mystery. And in research, I started to find out why and how those changes affected my grandfather and how he raised my mother. And we're at a draft that I was able to share with my surviving grandmother. And that was an interesting experience, sharing a draft with her where she could read about herself. And definitely it echoes a lot of the conversation we had tonight.
Mm-hmm. Marion, what about you? What is next for you?
Well, I will get off this live stream and touch base with my sister, who wants to know what's next for me. I'm actually working on a novel. I'm also, my husband and I together have a publishing company where we publish his novels. And we're working on one that is speculative fiction this summer. And I'm hopefully on the last draft of my own first novel. Hopefully.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Vanessa, what about you? We know we've got the Haw Eaters coming out. What
the
else?
Haw Eaters, which was supposed to be published in April, but then COVID-19 struck and upended everything for everybody. And so I believe that's now coming out on August 1st. So that's the next thing, big thing to come out there. Of course, I work as a science journalist, so I write a lot of magazine articles on a wide variety of topics. I don't just write about Lyme disease. And in fact, when it's the magazine world, I try to write about other things. So I cover mostly nature and the environment. So I write about forest fires and earthworms and all sorts of wonderful things out there in nature. That's primarily what I do. And of course, I have the Lyme Report, which is a subscription email newsletter that goes out bi-monthly. So pretty much every afternoon I'm working on something to do with the Lyme Report. So I'm reading more research and more research and more research, or talking to researchers, or doing some sort of thing to market it. But yeah, so it's all Lyme all the time here, except when I manage to get a magazine article writing about something else. So that's really where I am right now, because that's a big project in its own right.
And just one more question for you, Vanessa. Who is the Haw Eaters based on? You want to just maybe give a little bit of a background on it?
Right, so the Haw Eaters is a historical novel, and it's based on an 1877 murder that happened on Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. And two members of one family murdered two members of another family. And the two people who were murdered were related to me like way far back. So there are my grandmother's great-grandfather and his son who were murdered. And so this was really, this is sort of a passion project. So it came to me, my grandmother was the first one to tell the tale to us, who told it to my mother, who then told me the story. And then I was just fascinated by it. So I just wanted, first of all, to find out whether it really happened, because sometimes family lore isn't as accurate as you would like it to be. Really researching to see, yes, it really did happen. That there were documents at the Library and Archives Canada and Archives of Ontario, and then I just sort of did the research and sort of tried to make up the story of what actually happened, because what I found out very early, because my tendency as a journalist is to do everything nonfiction, was that everybody lied in these court documents. Everybody who gave testimony, they lied. It was a whole bunch of liars. And so here you are over 100 years out, almost 150 years out. There's no way to tell what the real truth was. And so you had to sort of go back through these documents and try to figure out, how did it most likely go down, and who was the biggest liar here, and who most likely came closest to the truth. And of course, I'm working primarily from court documents, and women are largely unrecorded in court documents. It was a different time in history. Women were basically invisible in the public sphere. And so really you had to make up the women characters. I wrote women back into the story because history wrote them out by not including them in the court case and what actually happened. So that was a great adventure right there. So The High Eaters comes out in August. Canadian history at its finest.
Looking forward to it. Definitely.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. It's great.
Well, I think that's probably about all the time that we have. Thank you so much for joining me and for having this conversation. I think that it was really interesting. And despite a couple of technical issues, I think it went very well. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened, who left their questions. Just a reminder again that those links are in the comments and in the description. Remember to use that Health20 discount code. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Ashley.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. This time I'll sign off on purpose.